Jamal had always been a dreamer. He grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and the world felt safe. But everything changed when his family moved to the city. The streets were busier, the people more distant, and the school he would now attend was larger than anything he had ever seen. It was overwhelming. On his first day, Jamal tried to be optimistic, telling himself that things would be fine. He walked through the school gates, holding his backpack tightly, hoping to make a good first impression. But the moment he stepped into his new classroom, Jamal knew it wasn't going to be that simple. As he entered, he could feel the eyes on him, whispers, the soft sounds of snickering. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination. But as the teacher introduced him to the class, things only got worse. Some of the students smiled politely, but others just stared. It wasn't like the friendly faces he remembered from his old school. A group of kids in the back row started whispering louder, their eyes fixed on him. Jamal noticed one of them, a boy named Todd, who gave him an unkind smile. Todd was one of the bigger kids with a look that said he was used to getting what he wanted, and right then Jamal could feel the tension. He sat down at the desk in the back trying to blend in, but it didn't work. He could hear snickers whenever he raised his hand or answered a question. His accent, the way he spoke, made him stand out in a way he didn't want. Lunchtime came and Jamal, not knowing where to go, wandered around the cafeteria looking for a spot. He saw groups of kids laughing and talking, but he felt like an outsider. He ended up sitting by himself at a small table in the corner. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what was happening. Why was it so hard to fit in here? It wasn't like his old school, where people were friendly and open. Here it felt like everyone was looking at him like he didn't belong. After a while, Todd and a couple of his friends walked past Jamal's table. They stopped in front of him and began laughing loudly. "Look at this," Todd said with a smirk. "What are you even doing here? This isn't your place." Jamal didn't know how to respond. His heart was pounding in his chest and his hands were shaking. The laughter from Todd and his friends felt like a weight on his shoulders, and for the first time Jamal felt small. The rest of the week was a blur of awkward encounters. Todd seemed to target Jamal every chance he got. In gym class, when Jamal was the last to finish running a lap, Todd made sure everyone heard him yell, "Hey, slowpoke, you're going to be last forever." At lunch, the teasing continued, and it seemed like every time Jamal opened his mouth, the others found a reason to laugh. He wasn't used to being treated this way. He had never experienced racism before, and here it felt like it was everywhere. Jamal started dreading school. The excitement he had felt about starting fresh in a new place slowly turned into anxiety. Every day felt like a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The worst part was that it didn't stop. It wasn't just Todd, it was the whole group of kids. They had their own ways of making Jamal feel small. As the days passed, Jamal grew more withdrawn. He stopped answering questions in class. He started sitting alone at lunch, avoiding any interaction with the other students. He wanted to escape, to go back to the place where he felt safe and welcomed. But there was no going back now. This was his new reality, and it felt unbearable. The bullies, led by Todd, weren't just making fun of Jamal's accent or the way he looked. They were making him feel like he didn't belong. They saw him as different, as an outsider. But Jamal didn't understand why that had to matter. He wasn't asking for anything special. All he wanted was to fit in, to feel like he was part of the community. But each day it seemed like that was slipping further and further away. Then one afternoon, after another round of teasing from Todd and his friends, something changed in Jamal. He was walking to class when Todd shoved him into the lockers, laughing, as he did. Jamal stumbled, his books scattered on the floor, and a few students turned to look. Todd's laugh echoed in Jamal's ears, and for a moment it felt like the world had stopped. But then something inside him snapped. For the first time since arriving at the school, Jamal didn't feel afraid. He felt angry. He wasn't sure where it came from, but he felt the power in his anger like a fire burning inside him. He stood up slowly, dusting off his clothes. He didn't look at Todd or the others. He simply walked away. But as he did, he made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to let this define him. The rest of the day went by in a blur, but something had shifted in Jamal. The next morning when he walked into class, he didn't slink to the back row. He sat in the front, straightening his back, holding his head high. He didn't care about the whispers anymore. He wasn't going to let the bullies win. He had his own strength, and it was time for him to find it. Jamal was no longer the scared new kid. He was something more. Something stronger. The next few days felt different for Jamal. He still heard the whispers, still saw the mocking glances, but he wasn't affected like before. It was like something inside him had hardened, and now he was determined not to let anyone break him. The bullies, led by Todd, had never been more relentless, but Jamal was no longer backing down. He focused on his studies, pouring his energy into his books. It became a refuge, a place where the world outside didn't matter. Jamal's teachers noticed a change. He was answering questions with confidence, taking part in class discussions with a level of understanding that surprised everyone. He wasn't just getting by anymore. He was excelling. But Todd and his crew were relentless. They didn't like seeing Jamal succeed. They saw his quiet strength as a challenge, a threat to their power. One afternoon, in the middle of math class, Todd pulled a prank. He snatched Jamal's notebook from his desk and began flipping through it loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Look at this," Todd called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The new kid actually thinks he can do math." The class laughed, but Jamal's heart didn't race like it used to. Instead of retreating, Jamal stood up. He walked over to Todd's desk, snatched his notebook back, and looked at him calmly. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said quietly. "You can keep laughing, but that won't change anything." The classroom fell silent. For a moment, Todd didn't know how to react. He stared at Jamal, who had a quiet but unwavering confidence in his eyes. Jamal wasn't angry, wasn't looking for a fight. He had simply stopped caring about Todd's opinion. It was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't need to let Todd's bullying control his life anymore. From that day on, something shifted. The whispers still followed Jamal through the hallways, but they didn't hurt as much. He had found a new sense of peace. His focus was on his work, his dreams, his future. But as much as he tried to ignore it, Todd didn't stop. If anything, his attacks grew more subtle, more personal. One day after class, Todd cornered Jamal in the hallway. "You think you're better than me now?" Todd sneered, his eyes full of contempt. "What are you trying to prove, huh?" Jamal could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he didn't let it show. He looked Todd in the eye, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not trying to prove anything, but if you think this is about you, you're wrong. I'm doing this for me." Todd's face flushed with embarrassment. He had expected Jamal to back down, to apologize. But instead, he saw something in Jamal, something that made him uncomfortable. Jamal had stopped being afraid, and in that moment, Todd realized he was no longer the one in control. It didn't happen all at once, but over time, Jamal started to see a change. The bullying became less frequent. The whispers faded away. People started looking at him differently, not as the new kid to pick on, but as someone with his own strength. He had found a way to stand tall without letting the world crush him. He had learned how to use his mind, his actions, and his words to create his own space in the world. Still, there was one more hurdle Jamal had to face. Todd wasn't ready to let go of his position at the top of the social ladder. One afternoon, during gym class, he decided to make Jamal's life miserable again. He shoved Jamal hard during a game of basketball, sending him tumbling to the floor. A few kids laughed, but Jamal didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, wiping the dust off his pants. His body was sore, but his spirit wasn't broken. He walked back to the court, looking Todd dead in the eye, and said, "Is that all you've got?" Todd looked at him, surprised, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. It was a small moment, but it felt like a victory. Jamal had stopped being the target. He had stopped being the victim. He had become something more. Someone who wouldn't let anyone define him. That night, Jamal sat in his room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The road had been long and painful, but in some strange way, it had made him stronger. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. And more than that, he had learned that the true power didn't come from revenge or fighting back with anger. It came from standing tall in the face of adversity, from holding your ground even when everything seemed stacked against you. The next day when Jamal walked into school, something felt different. It wasn't just the way the students looked at him or the fact that Todd didn't dare approach him anymore. It was the way Jamal looked at himself. He no longer felt like an outsider. He was part of the world now, a world that couldn't break him no matter how hard it tried. As the days passed, Jamal continued to focus on what mattered most to him, his future. He knew that the school years would eventually come to an end and that the bullies would fade away. But the lessons he had learned, the strength he had discovered within himself, would stay with him forever. He wasn't just surviving in this new world, he was becoming unstoppable. Weeks went by and Jamal's transformation became undeniable. The once shy, anxious newcomer had become someone everyone took notice of. He had stopped shrinking from the bullies, stopped fearing their words. Instead, he had harnessed his anger, his frustration, and turned it into something constructive. Jamal threw himself into his studies and his athletic pursuits. Schoolwork that once felt like an obstacle became an opportunity for growth, a way to prove to himself that he was more than the bully's version of him. He had always been smart, but now he was excelling. He aced every test, answered every question, and participated in every class discussion with the kind of clarity and confidence that stunned his teachers. They had never seen him like this before. The shy boy who had once kept to himself was now a leader, his voice heard in every corner of the classroom. But it wasn't just his grades that began to improve. His athleticism, too, started to shine. In gym class, Jamal was no longer the slow kid. He was fast, powerful, and determined to prove he belonged. Whether it was basketball, soccer, or running, Jamal pushed himself harder than anyone else. His teammates noticed his relentless drive and began to respect him. Even Todd and his friends couldn't help but watch in awe as Jamal seemed to rise above them in every field. One day during a basketball game, Jamal found himself on the court, facing off against Todd's team. The crowd was buzzing, the energy high. Todd, with his usual cocky smile, stood at the edge of the court, waiting for the game to begin. Jamal wasn't sure if he was more nervous about the game or about the fact that this was the moment where everything would change. As the game progressed, Jamal's confidence grew. Every time he took a shot, it went in. Every pass he made was perfect. His teammates began to trust him more, and with each play, Jamal felt his confidence soar. But then, as the final moments of the game ticked down, something unexpected happened. Todd, frustrated and angry, shoved Jamal as he went for a rebound. The push sent Jamal flying into the bleachers. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The gym went silent, and everyone turned to see Jamal on the ground. Todd, standing tall with his arms crossed, smirked. But Jamal didn't stay down for long. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, the familiar anger bubbling up. But this time, instead of letting it consume him, Jamal stood up slowly, wiped the dirt off his clothes, and faced Todd without flinching. "Is this how you play?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. Todd's smirk faded, replaced with a hint of hesitation. For a moment, the entire gym held its breath. Jamal's words weren't just about the game anymore. They were a message, a declaration of who he had become. He wasn't going to let Todd or anyone push him around anymore. With that, the game continued, but it wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about proving something bigger, proving to himself that, no matter what Todd or anyone else tried, he could never be knocked down again. As the buzzer went off, marking Jamal's team's victory, he felt a sense of satisfaction that he couldn't put into words. He had won. But more importantly, he had shown the whole school that he was no longer a target. He was unstoppable. Next day, Jamal noticed something different. When he walked through the hallways, the whispers had stopped. The laughter, the taunts, everything had quieted down. He wasn't just the kid they picked on anymore. People were starting to recognize his strength, not just in basketball or his grades, but in the way he carried himself. Jamal wasn't invisible anymore. He was someone people looked up to. Even Todd, who had once been the king of the school's social ladder, started to look at him differently. It was clear that something had shifted. Todd, who had once ruled the school with intimidation and insults, now avoided Jamal. It was as if the power dynamic had completely reversed. Jamal didn't need to fight or argue. All he had to do was stand tall and be himself. The respect, the admiration followed naturally, but Jamal's journey wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about showing Todd or anyone else that he was better. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above the negativity, above the stereotypes, and above the bullies who had tried to tear him down. And as the weeks passed, Jamal's story became a source of inspiration for others. The kids, who had once laughed at him, now saw him as a symbol of strength, determination, and resilience. One afternoon during a school assembly, Jamal was called to the stage to receive an award for academic excellence. As he stood there facing the entire school, he felt a sense of pride that he had never experienced before. The applause was loud, and for the first time, it didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like sympathy. It felt earned. As Jamal looked out at the crowd, he saw the faces of his classmates, many of whom had once mocked him. They were no longer the same. Some of them had come up to him in the past weeks, apologizing for their actions, realizing the hurt they had caused. It was clear that Jamal had done more than just rise above the bullying. He had changed the atmosphere of the entire school. The very thing that was meant to break him had made him stronger. Walking off the stage, Jamal felt a sense of peace. The battle had been hard, but it had been worth it. He had learned something valuable. The power to rise above wasn't just about defeating the bullies. It was about never letting their words define you. It was about finding the strength within yourself to be better, no matter how hard life tried to knock you down. As the months passed, Jamal began to feel the weight of his transformation settle into his bones. He had gone from the quiet, isolated boy who once dreaded stepping foot into school to someone who walked through the hallways with a quiet confidence. His grades were stellar, his athletic abilities were unmatched, and more importantly, his inner strength had started to shine through in ways he hadn't anticipated. But for Jamal, the most significant change wasn't in how others saw him. It was in how he saw himself. The boy who had once been overwhelmed by the weight of racism and bullying was now the one others turned to for advice. Jamal had become the voice of reason, the one who spoke with clarity when others struggled to find the right words. His experiences had shaped him into someone others looked up to. He was no longer the victim. He had become the hero of his own story. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. Todd, although no longer the loud, brash bully he once was, still couldn't help but try to push Jamal's buttons. There were moments, small, petty moments, when Todd would try to undermine Jamal, to bring him back down. It wasn't obvious at first, but Jamal started to notice it. A sarcastic comment here, a snide remark there. But Jamal wasn't the same person he had been when he first arrived at the school. One day after school, Jamal was walking to his locker when he heard Todd's voice behind him. "You think you're some kind of hero now, huh?" Todd called out, his voice dripping with bitterness. "What did you do? Just get lucky?" Jamal stopped in his tracks, not turning around right away. He could feel the old anger begin to stir, but he refused to let it control him. He turned slowly, looking at Todd. "I didn't get lucky," Jamal said, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "I worked for it. You don't just get things handed to you. You have to fight for them." For a moment, there was silence. Todd's face was red with embarrassment, but Jamal could see the faint flicker of something else. Regret, perhaps. Todd looked like he was searching for the right words, but Jamal didn't give him the chance to say anything else. "You don't get to define me anymore," Jamal continued, his voice steady. "You don't get to control my life." With that, Jamal turned and walked away, leaving Todd standing in the hallway, unsure of how to respond. As Jamal walked, he could feel the weight of the moment sinking in. He had faced Todd one last time, and this time he had won, not with his fists, but with his words, his strength, and his self-respect. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The dynamics in the school began to shift. Jamal's courage had inspired others, and not just the kids who had once been his friends, but even some of the ones who had stood by while the bullying took place. They began to question their own behavior. They began to see the harm in their indifference. Jamal became something more than a symbol of strength. He became a catalyst for change. Students who had once laughed at his accent, his clothes, and his background were now speaking up when they saw others being picked on. Jamal's quiet resolve had ignited something in them. They had seen how one person could change everything, how one person's strength could inspire a whole community. Even the teachers began to take notice. Jamal had become a voice in the school, an unshakable force in the midst of everything that had once seemed so out of his control. His guidance counselor, Mrs. Matthews, often pulled him aside after class to ask for his opinion on how to address bullying at the school. "You've got a way of seeing things that the rest of us don't," she'd tell him. "You've been through something we can't even imagine, and you've come out stronger for it. That's powerful." Jamal, once unsure of his place in the world, had now found his voice. He was using his own experiences to help others. And as he did, he began to realize something profound. He didn't just want to be a survivor of his circumstances. He wanted to change the system that had allowed him to be hurt in the first place. He wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to go through what he had. One afternoon, he gathered a group of students, kids who had once been part of Todd's crew, and began talking about the importance of standing up not just for themselves but for each other. He shared his story, not as a tale of revenge but as one of redemption. He spoke about the power of kindness, the strength found in helping others, and how together they could create a school where bullying didn't have a place. By the end of the meeting, many of the students were nodding in agreement, their faces determined. They began brainstorming ideas for campaigns and programs to combat bullying, and Jamal found himself at the center of it all, his voice leading the charge. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just changing his own story. He was changing the story for everyone else too. The school year ended, and Jamal felt a sense of accomplishment that was far greater than any victory he had ever imagined. The bullies were gone, not because they had been punished, but because they had been shown a better way. The students who had once turned their backs on him now stood with him, united by a shared understanding of what it meant to rise above the hate. When Jamal graduated, he walked across the stage with his head held high, not just as a student who had overcome bullying, but as a young man who had transformed the very culture of his school. He had learned that strength didn't always mean standing tall in the face of adversity. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was to change the world around you without ever lifting a finger in anger. And as he looked out at the crowd of students and teachers, he knew that the most important lesson of all wasn't about getting revenge or proving others wrong. It was about using your story to make the world a better place no matter how many obstacles stood in your way. Jamal had become unstoppable, not because he had defeated his enemies, but because he had found his true strength. And that was something no one could ever take away from him. The summer after graduation brought Jamal a newfound sense of freedom. He had left the walls of the school behind, but the lessons he had learned stayed with him every day. His confidence had been built from countless moments of standing tall, facing adversity, and proving to himself that he could overcome anything. He wasn't the same person who had stepped into that school just a few short years ago. Jamal had grown in ways he hadn't expected. The boy who had once been pushed around by bullies had transformed into a young man with an unshakable sense of self-worth. But despite the progress he had made, Jamal wasn't done yet. The change he had sparked in his school, the conversations, the new alliances, the students who now spoke out against bullying, felt like the beginning of something much larger. He had been part of something bigger than just his own survival. He had become part of a movement, a force for good that reached beyond the walls of his school and into the world at large. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in the quiet of his room, he began to think about his next steps. He had always known that he wanted to help others, to make a difference, but now he felt a deeper calling. He wanted to be a voice for those who still felt powerless, for those who had not yet found the strength to stand up for themselves. He knew what it was like to feel like an outsider, to be judged by the color of his skin and the way he spoke. But he also knew how powerful it was to take control of your story and rewrite it. Jamal decided that he wanted to become an advocate for others who were facing bullying, racism, and discrimination. He began to research organizations that focused on anti-bullying campaigns and youth empowerment. He reached out to a few local groups offering his story and his help. His message was simple: no one should have to go through what he did, but more importantly, he wanted to show young people that they didn't have to fight alone. Strength came from unity, from standing together and supporting each other. It didn't take long before Jamal found a group that was dedicated to helping young people navigate the complexities of bullying, racism, and self-worth. They were a nonprofit organization that provided workshops, seminars, and resources for students across the city. They wanted to empower kids to not just survive, but thrive, regardless of the challenges they faced. Jamal was invited to speak at one of their events, and he felt an excitement he hadn't experienced in years. This was his chance to make a real difference. When the day of the event arrived, Jamal stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. The auditorium was full of young faces, many of them uncertain, many of them carrying their own burdens. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was sharing a piece of himself with every single person in that room. He was going to show them that they weren't alone, that they had the strength to overcome whatever obstacles they faced. As he walked onto the stage, the room fell silent. Jamal could feel the eyes of the audience on him, but this time, it didn't make him nervous. Instead, it fueled him. He had something important to say, and he knew this was the moment that could change everything. He began by sharing his journey, how he had come to school as an outsider, the bullying, the taunts, the moments when he had felt like giving up. But he didn't stop there. He talked about how he had fought back, not with fists but with resilience, with strength, and with a deep belief that he was worth more than the labels others tried to place on him. He spoke of the power of kindness, of standing up for others, and of the importance of finding your voice no matter how small you feel. As Jamal spoke, he saw the faces in the crowd soften. He saw tears in some eyes and nods of understanding in others. He was no longer just a kid telling a story. He was a young man who had faced the very worst and emerged stronger for it. He was a living example that change was possible, that no matter how bad things seemed, there was always a way out. And it wasn't about fighting back with anger or hatred. It was about finding your inner strength and using it to lift others up. By the time Jamal finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was an outpouring of emotion, of recognition. Jamal had given them hope. He had shown them that they didn't have to let the world define them, that they could stand up for themselves no matter what. But the most important part of Jamal's journey was yet to come. His work with the organization grew, and he began to travel to schools across the city, sharing his story with more and more students. He realized that the change he had started in his own school was just the beginning. As Jamal spoke to more students, he saw the same transformation in them that he had experienced himself. He saw kids who had been too afraid to speak up begin to find their voices. He saw young people who had been bullied for being different begin to take pride in their uniqueness. And with each speech, each workshop, Jamal knew he was making a difference. It was a long road, and there were times when Jamal questioned whether his efforts were enough. But with every person he helped, every life he touched, he realized that his journey had a purpose. He was no longer the boy who had been pushed around. He was the man who had become unstoppable, not because of what he had overcome, but because of what he had given back. Jamal's story didn't end when he graduated high school. It had only just begun. He had learned that true strength wasn't just about standing alone in the face of adversity. It was about standing with others, helping them find their own strength, and creating a world where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. And as Jamal continued to speak, to share, and to inspire, he realized that no matter where life took him next, he would always be unstoppable. Not because he was invincible, but because he had learned to rise every time life knocked him down.